So I just finished watching Curtis Yarvin's podcast with the New York Times called Curtis Yarvin on the End of American Democracy. So in my video about Doge and data, a lot of people were mentioning Curtis Yarvin and tagging him, and in subsequent videos as well. So I decided to give him a look. To be frank with you, have literally never heard of him until a lot of people were tagging him, but I'm glad that you all did. So my first read of him is, frankly, he gives me, I won't say alt-right, but I'll definitely say libertarian, techie, San Francisco out there troll, kind of. Like, I think he is earnest in general with what he believes, but the way he delivers it is very much giving troll. So I have been a reader of blogs, and I was around in the days of WordPress, and I read actually a lot of these libertarian alt-right blogs just because I'm always curious about how people that have a different political viewpoint think. So this type of hyperbole is very common. It's they are the original own the libs people. So like when he was talking and the interviewer was pushing on him on stuff, it's like, okay, he said some things tongue in cheek that he didn't mean literally, but essentially the thoughts and the ideas he is loyal to. So some of the points that he touched on were his hypothesis about America being better off as a monarchy. He even outright said in the interview that he doesn't think that this is going to happen in this election. Not only does he think because of the bloat of government, Trump will be ineffective, but that even if he were, he isn't even the type of person that you would necessarily put in charge install as a monarch. So his main hypothesis, or the main reason why he believes American democracy should eventually end or will eventually end, is just because of the size and the bloat of the federal government. It's become inefficient, and it would be more efficient if it was run essentially like a startup with a CEO or monarch, dictator, whatever you want to call it. And his cited historical sources were FDR and George Washington. My pushback against that is that those two could not be considered dictators because FDR did do more than 2 terms. However, he was kind of in extraordinary circumstances. He inherited a Great Depression America, and of course, the World War II happened. He ended up passing in office. Truman took the torch, and Truman served out the rest, I guess, of FDR's term and 2 additional terms. The same thing with George Washington. George Washington did not pass in office, but he stepped down after his 2 terms. So to me, those are not true examples of American monarchy. Another one of his points of view is essentially harkening back to what I said before, is that the bloat of the federal government is what's making it super inefficient. So he used the example of SpaceX and NASA. So he was saying that at some point NASA was as efficient as SpaceX, but because of the largest in the federal government, NASA has slowed down with innovation, and it's not delivering on the cool space stuff that it should. And essentially, if you were to want to reform NASA, in essence, you would have to tear it down down to its bones and rebuild it from there. My pushback again against that is that fundamentally, I don't think SpaceX is as productive as NASA. SpaceX, it's 2025. SpaceX has yet to put a man on the moon. NASA put a man on the moon in 1969. So it's like the framework for actually building the technology to put a human being on a moon or even a different planet is basically there. So the fact that SpaceX can't even replicate what America has done in the mid 20th century, it to me is like, okay, well, that wasn't a very good example. Personally, I don't think. So one of the things that did explicitly strike me as edgelordy was his comparison of the Norwegian mass unaliver that was anti-Islam, that unalived a bunch of people at a school camp or whatever in Norway, to Nelson Mandela. So he said effectively, you can't tell me to condemn the Norwegian guy if you still uphold Nelson Mandela. And the interviewer pushed back and was like, how can you compare the two? Nelson Mandela was in jail and put on a terrorist organization list because he was fighting brutal apartheid South African governance, whereas this other guy was just radicalized and was unaliving innocent people for like this far out political point. Well, this is the thing. Like, this is where like he uses this, and you guys gotta get familiar with recognizing what I like to call verbal sleight of hand. So people will say things that on the surface literally sound right, but in the details of it don't really make sense. And he was like, well, technically they were on the Mandela was on the terrorist watch list, and he essentially led a movement that did ultimately lead to the unaliving of people in South Africa, apartheid South Africa. But like, that's different than equivocating him with someone who took a pew pew and directly unalived people, not in a fight for freedom or fight to alleviate oppression, but just out of frustration and political anger. So to me, it's a false equivalency, and that is what especially solidified to me that like, oh, okay, this is like one of these libertarian, far out San Francisco techie dude edgelords, which, I mean, that's a thing, right? So another example of Yarvin's, to me, verbal sleight of hand was his mentioning of, so the podcaster mentioned one of his works that said, oh, what happened in the 1860s in America, so the American Civil War, the outcome of that didn't improve anyone's lives. So anyone, he clarified, meant like groups of people in terms of Union soldiers and specifically African Americans that were freed from slavery. And the author was like, well, how can you say that? Like, that's clearly racist. Oh, obviously the thing here is that the slavery ended, and in the long run, African Americans were better off. But the sleight of hand comes in for me here when Yarvin retorts that, oh, well, because there were slave narratives that you could see, there was a lot of slaves that were complaining about their condition post-war. But to me, the presence of a complaint in and of itself is not an indicator of how they felt about being free or not, right? So in theory, right, if a slave is property and the slave is now freed, the slave has to fend, or slave is now freed, so they're a freedman, let's call them that. The freedman now has to fend for himself, and because of that is actually more vulnerable to domestic terrorist organizations that begin and end with a K in between. So that could be the reason why these freedmen were complaining about their lot in life after slavery. It's not necessarily jumping to the conclusion that because they complained, ergo they were better off in slavery. That is a logical fallacy, and it's not an appropriate leap to make. And the next point, as far as that particular example was concerned, was Yarvin mentioned that, oh, he saw some statistic that between the years of 1865 and 1870, a quarter of the freedmen African-American population essentially perished. But again, like that, the fact that there's a statistic, let me take him at his word that this is a true statistic. Even the fact of that doesn't necessarily get you to the ends that he wants you to get to. He's counting on the reader to make that logical leap so he can hide his hand and say, oh, that's not what I said. That's not what I meant. Because if a quarter of them passed away, that could be due to lynching. That may not be due to the fact that, oh, they fell into poverty and they starved to death and they couldn't take care of themselves without the benevolence of a master. It could be as simple as they were targeted for being Black and free and quote unquote not knowing their place. So, yeah, I thought it was an interesting interview. I think in general, he does believe some of the things that he's saying, but he's definitely playing it up and being a little bit tongue in cheek to rile up people that would read those works. Yeah, but we'll see how it goes. I thought it was kind of funny how the interviewer asked him, well, were you invited to the inauguration? Because he said, oh, I'm not going to go. And the interviewer called him and was like, well, were you actually offered or invited? He said, no, I wasn't. I thought that was hilarious because he really tried to be smug and like passe about it, but you can't reject an invitation that you never received. Okay, be well.